The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty Montana town of Silver Creek, and Eleanor Hartwell pressed her gloved hand against the window, her heart sinking as she took in the rough-hewn buildings and dirt streets that would be her new home in this summer of 1882. Behind her, strapped precariously to the coach's roof among her trunks and belongings, sat the mahogany upright piano that had been her mother's pride and joy, the one piece of her former life in Boston that she absolutely refused to leave behind. Her father's debts had taken everything else, the creditors circling like vultures after his death 6 months prior. But Eleanor had fought tooth and nail to keep that piano, even though hauling it across half the country to accept a teaching position in this frontier town seemed like madness to everyone who knew her. She stepped down from the coach onto the wooden sidewalk, smoothing her traveling dress and adjusting her hat as the driver began unloading her belongings. The piano would need to come down last, carefully, and she found herself worrying her lower lip as she watched him work. A small crowd had gathered, curious about the newcomer, and she felt their eyes on her like a physical weight. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and alone in a place where women were scarce and everyone knew everyone else's business within an hour of it happening. Miss Hartwell. A thin woman in a severe gray dress approached, her face pinched but not unkind. "I am Mrs. Abigail Crawford. The school board sent me to meet you and show you to your lodgings." Eleanor shook her hand gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford. I appreciate your kindness in meeting me. I hope the accommodations will have space for my piano. I wrote ahead about it in my last letter." Mrs. Crawford's expression shifted, becoming apologetic. "Yes, about that. I am afraid there was some confusion. The room we have prepared for you is quite small, just above the general store. There is barely space for a bed and washstand, let alone a piano of that size." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. She turned to look at the instrument being carefully lowered from the coach's roof by the driver and another man who had come to help. The piano gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its wood lovingly polished, its keys still perfectly in tune despite the arduous journey. "But I explained that I needed accommodations for it. The piano is not merely a possession, Mrs. Crawford. It was my mother's, and she taught me to play before she passed when I was 12. I teach piano as well as regular schooling. Surely there must be somewhere. I am truly sorry." Mrs. Crawford seemed genuinely distressed. "Perhaps we can find storage for it, and you might arrange to play it at the church on occasion." The thought of her mother's piano gathering dust in some warehouse or barn made Eleanor's throat tight. She blinked back tears, refusing to cry in front of these strangers. She had already lost so much, given up so much to come here and start over. Was it too much to ask that she keep this one connection to her past, to her mother's memory? "Excuse me, ma'am." A deep voice spoke from behind her, and Eleanor turned to find herself looking up at a tall man in dusty work clothes, a worn hat pushed back on his head to reveal sun-bronzed features and eyes the color of a summer sky. He held his hat respectfully as he addressed her, and she noticed his hands were calloused and strong, the hands of someone who worked hard for his living. "I could not help but overhear your predicament. I am James Mitchell. I run a cattle ranch about 5 miles outside town, and I happened to be here picking up supplies when I heard about your piano." Eleanor waited, hope flickering uncertainly in her chest. James Mitchell looked to be in his late 20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face that seemed honest despite the weathering of sun and wind. There was something steady about him, something that made her want to trust him even though they had just met. "My ranch house has plenty of room," he continued, his voice quiet but carrying a warmth that surprised her. "And I have been thinking about hiring someone to help with cooking and household management. My mother passed 2 years ago, and the place has become rather rough around the edges with just me and my ranch hands keeping it running. If you would consider staying at the ranch instead of in town, there would be more than enough space for your piano. You could still teach at the school during the day, of course. The ride is not so far." Mrs. Crawford made a disapproving noise. Mr. Mitchell, I hardly think it proper for an unmarried woman to stay at your ranch. What would people say? They would say that I offered someone in need a solution to her problem, James replied calmly, though Eleanor noticed a muscle tighten in his jaw. And they would also note that I have 3 ranch hands who live on the property, along with old Charlie who has been cooking for us and making a mess of it. There would be plenty of chaperones, if that is what concerns you. Miss Hartwell would have her own room in the main house, completely separate from everyone else. Eleanor studied him carefully. The offer was generous, perhaps too generous, and she knew Mrs. Crawford was right that staying at a bachelor's ranch would raise eyebrows. But the alternative was losing her piano, and she found she could not bear that. There was something else too, something in the way James Mitchell looked at her piano with respect rather than puzzlement that made her think he understood what it meant to her. Would there truly be room for the piano? She asked. It is quite large and I would want to play it regularly, which means it would need to be somewhere it would not disturb everyone. James smiled, and the expression transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. The ranch house has a front room that barely gets used. It faces east, so it gets good morning light. There is a fireplace to keep it warm in winter. I think your piano would fit there just fine and the sound would be welcome. It has been too quiet out there since my mother passed. She used to sing while she worked, and I have missed having music in the house. The sincerity in his words touched something deep in Eleanor's heart. She made her decision quickly before she could second-guess herself. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Mitchell, if you are certain it would not be an imposition. I can cook and manage a household. My mother taught me well before she died, and I have been keeping house for my father these past years. And I promise the piano, and I will not be too much of a burden. No burden at all, ma'am. James's smile widened. Though I should warn you, the ranch is rough living compared to what you are probably used to. Montana winters are hard, and ranch life means early mornings and long days. I am not afraid of hard work, Mr. Mitchell. Eleanor lifted her chin. And I have already come this far. I am not about to turn back now. Mrs. Crawford sputtered protests, but Eleanor ignored her, turning her attention to the piano as James called over 2 of his men who had been loading supplies into a wagon. Together, they began the careful process of securing the instrument for the journey to the ranch. Eleanor watched anxiously, giving instructions on how to pad and protect it, and she noticed that James himself took extra care, checking and double-checking the ropes and blankets they used. An hour later, Eleanor found herself sitting on the wagon bench next to James Mitchell, her trunks and belongings loaded in the back along with his supplies, while the piano rode in a separate flatbed wagon driven by one of his ranch hands. The town of Silver Creek fell away behind them as they headed west into rolling grassland dotted with cattle and bisected by clear streams that rushed down from the mountains in the distance. Those are the Rockies, James said, nodding toward the snow-capped peaks on the horizon. Beautiful, are they not? I came out here 5 years ago from Kansas. My father had died and my mother wanted a fresh start. We used what little we had to buy the ranch from a man who was giving up and heading back east. It was run down then, barely more than a shack and some scrubland, but we built it up together. She made it a home. You must miss her terribly, Eleanor said softly, watching his profile as he spoke. Every day. James was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. But life goes on and the ranch goes on. She would not want me moping around feeling sorry for myself. She always said that hard work and purpose were the best cures for grief. Eleanor nodded, understanding completely. My mother said something similar. She told me that music was a gift and that gifts were meant to be shared. After she died, I kept playing because it made me feel close to her. And when my father got sick and the money troubles started, I took students to help make ends meet. The piano kept us going in more ways than one. They talked easily as the wagon rolled across the prairie, and Eleanor found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of her situation. James told her about the ranch, about the cattle operation he was building and his hopes to expand. She told him about Boston, about her work as a teacher, about the music she loved. The afternoon sun warmed her shoulders, and the vast, open sky seemed to promise possibilities she had never imagined back in the narrow streets of her former home. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low hill, and Eleanor caught her breath. It was larger than she had expected, a sprawling wooden structure with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides. Outbuildings dotted the surrounding area, barns and bunkhouses and corrals where horses moved restlessly. The setting was beautiful, nestled in a valley with a creek running through it and mountains rising in the distance. "It is not fancy," James said, sounding almost apologetic. "But it is solid and well built." "It is wonderful," Eleanor said honestly. "I was expecting something much more primitive." James laughed. "My mother insisted on certain standards. She designed the house herself, made sure it had real windows and good floors. She said just because we were on the frontier did not mean we had to live like animals." He pulled the wagon up to the front porch, and several men emerged from the barn to help with the unloading. James introduced them quickly. Tom and Peter, both young ranch hands in their early 20s, and Charlie, a grizzled older man with kind eyes who served as cook and general manager of the household. They all tipped their hats respectfully to Eleanor, and she could see the curiosity in their faces. "Boys, this is Miss Eleanor Hartwell," James announced. "She will be staying in the main house and helping with the household management. And that," he gestured to the piano being carefully unloaded from the second wagon, "is her piano. We are going to need to get it inside without a scratch on it." "Understood," the men nodded. And for the next half hour, Eleanor held her breath as they maneuvered the heavy instrument up onto the porch and through the front door. James had cleared the front room ahead of time, she realized, pushing furniture aside to make space. The piano settled into place against the interior wall, and Eleanor ran her fingers along its surface, checking for damage. Everything seemed fine, and she let out a breath of relief. "Where would you like it exactly?" James asked, standing beside her. "We can move it anywhere in the room." Eleanor looked around, taking in the space. It was a beautiful room with large windows that let in golden afternoon light and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The furniture was simple but well made, and someone had clearly tried to keep the space clean, though it had the unlived-in feel of a room that was rarely used. "Here, I think," she said, gesturing to a spot near the windows but away from the fireplace's heat. "The temperature changes could damage it if it is too close to the fire." James nodded and directed the men to shift it slightly. When they had finished, Eleanor sat down on the bench and lifted the keyboard cover. Her fingers found the keys like coming home, and she played a few experimental notes. The piano had survived the journey beautifully, still perfectly in tune. Without thinking, she began to play a piece by Chopin, one of her mother's favorites, and the music filled the room like water filling a vessel. She became lost in the music, forgetting for a moment where she was and who was listening. When she finally finished and looked up, she found James standing near the fireplace, his expression unreadable. The other men had quietly left, but he remained, watching her with those blue eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "I have not heard anything like that since before we left Kansas. My mother used to take me to concerts when I was young." She loved music. Eleanor felt herself flush with pleasure at the compliment. "Thank you. It has been a while since I have played for pleasure rather than for teaching. It felt good." "You should play whenever you want," James said firmly. "This is your home now for as long as you want to stay. Make yourself comfortable." He showed her to her room then, a spacious chamber on the second floor with a large bed covered in a simple quilt, a wardrobe, a washstand, and even a small writing desk under the window. It was clean and neat, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the kindness of it. "I hope it will suit," James said from the doorway. "My mother's room is next door if you need anything from there. Her clothes and things are still in the wardrobe. You are welcome to anything that might be useful." "Thank you," Eleanor managed. "You have been so generous, Mr. Mitchell." "I promise I will earn my keep." "James," he said. "Please just call me James, and you do not need to earn anything. You are doing me a favor by bringing life back to this house." He touched his hat brim and left her then, and Eleanor sank onto the bed, wondering what she had gotten herself into. The first weeks at the ranch passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor rose early each morning to help Charlie prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, learning quickly that frontier cooking meant large quantities of simple, hearty food. After breakfast, James would drive her into town for her teaching duties at the school, returning to pick her up in the late afternoon. She spent her evenings playing the piano, cooking dinner, and gradually bringing order to the household that had been managed by well-meaning but inexperienced men for too long. She discovered that she enjoyed ranch life more than she had expected. There was a straightforwardness to it that appealed to her, a sense that hard work brought direct results. The ranch hands were respectful and kind, though she caught them sometimes stopping their work to listen when she played the piano in the evenings. Charlie proved to be a sweet old man who was grateful for her help in the kitchen and happily turned over most of the cooking duties to her capable hands. And then there was James. Eleanor found herself thinking about him far more than was proper. He was unfailingly kind and considerate, always making sure she had everything she needed, but there was also a reserve to him, a careful distance he maintained. She would catch him sometimes watching her play the piano, standing in the doorway with that unreadable expression, and her heart would skip in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. One evening in early August, after she had been at the ranch for nearly a month, Eleanor was playing a cheerful Mozart piece when James appeared in the doorway as he often did. This time, though, he did not simply stand and listen. He walked into the room and settled into one of the chairs near the piano. "Do you ever play anything more modern?" he asked when she finished the piece. Eleanor smiled. "What did you have in mind? I know some Stephen Foster, if that is modern enough for you." "My mother loved Beautiful Dreamer," James said quietly. "She used to sing it while she worked in the garden." Eleanor's fingers found the opening notes and she began to play, singing softly along with the melody. Her voice was not professionally trained, but it was clear and true, and she poured emotion into the words. When she finished, she looked up to find James's eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said roughly. "That meant more than you know." Something shifted between them in that moment, some barrier falling away. James began staying longer in the evenings, sitting and talking with her after dinner while she played. He told her stories about building the ranch, about his hopes and dreams for the future. She shared her own dreams, the ones she had thought were dead after her father's death and the loss of everything she had known. "I always wanted to teach children music," she confessed one night. "Not just the children of wealthy families who could afford private lessons, but all children. I think everyone should have the chance to learn, regardless of their circumstances." "Why do you not do that here?" James asked. "You could offer lessons at the ranch on weekends. I am sure there are families in the area who would love for their children to learn piano." The idea took root in Eleanor's mind, and within a week, she had posted notices in town offering piano instruction. To her delight, several families responded, and soon she had students coming to the ranch every Saturday afternoon. James cleared a schedule to make sure he was always there during the lessons, maintaining propriety, but Eleanor noticed how he seemed to enjoy the sound of scales and simple melodies filling the house. As summer turned to autumn, the leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek blazed gold and orange. Eleanor had been at the ranch for 3 months, and it felt more like home than Boston ever had. She knew she was falling in love with James Mitchell, though she tried to fight it. He was her employer in a sense, and she was dependent on his generosity. She could not risk their comfortable arrangement by revealing feelings that might not be returned, but one evening in late September, everything changed. Eleanor had just finished playing a particularly complex Beethoven sonata, one she had been practicing for weeks. She was frustrated because she kept stumbling over a difficult passage, and she put her head in her hands with a sigh of exasperation. "It sounds perfect to me," James said from his usual spot. "It is not perfect," Eleanor said. "I keep missing the same section. My mother could play it flawlessly. I wish I had inherited more of her talent." "Your mother would be proud of you," James said firmly. "Not just for your playing, but for everything you have done. You lost your father, your home, everything you knew, and you came out here and started over. That takes real courage." Eleanor looked up at him, and something in his expression made her heart pound. He rose from his chair and crossed to the piano, stopping just beside the bench where she sat. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "I need to tell you something, and I hope it will not make things awkward between us. These past months have been the happiest I have known since my mother died. This house has come alive again, and it is because of you. Not just because you cook and clean and bring order to everything, but because you are here. I find myself looking forward to the end of each day because I know I will get to hear you play and talk with you. I am falling in love with you, and I needed you to know, even if you do not feel the same." Eleanor's breath caught. She stood slowly, turning to face him fully. "James, I thought I was alone in feeling this way. I have been trying so hard not to let myself love you because I thought it would be hopeless, but I do. I love you." He reached for her then, his calloused hands gentle as they cupped her face. "May I kiss you?" he asked, and she nodded, her heart soaring. The kiss was sweet and careful, full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling like fools. James took her hand and led her to sit on the sofa, keeping her fingers entwined with his. "I want to marry you," he said. "I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything. I want you to stay here, not as an employee or a guest, but as my wife. I want to build a life with you." "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about the future with an excitement that made them both giddy. James wanted to get married soon before winter set in, and Eleanor agreed. There was no reason to wait when they both knew what they wanted. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a crisp November morning in the church in Silver Creek. Eleanor wore a dress of ivory silk that had belonged to James's mother, altered to fit her smaller frame. James wore his best suit, and Eleanor thought she had never seen anyone more handsome. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, along with neighboring ranchers and their families. Even Mrs. Crawford seemed to have softened toward the match, perhaps recognizing genuine love when she saw it. After the ceremony, they held a reception at the ranch. Eleanor's students played a simple piece they had learned in her honor, and there was dancing and feasting that lasted into the evening. When the guests finally left and they were alone, James led Eleanor to the front room where her piano stood. "I have a wedding gift for you," he said, his eyes sparkling with secret pleasure. "Close your eyes." Eleanor obeyed, and she heard him moving around the room. When he told her to open them again, she gasped. He had commissioned a beautiful wooden screen that could be pulled across part of the room, creating a separate space around the piano. "You said once that you wished you had a music room, a place where you could practice and teach without feeling like you were taking over the whole house," James explained. "I know this is not a separate room, but I thought if we could section off this area, it might feel more like your own space. And if you want, we can build an addition next spring, a proper music room with whatever you need." Eleanor threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "You asked if the ranch had room for my piano, and you said you would build a room around it. I thought that was just a figure of speech." "I meant it literally," James said, holding her close. "I will build you anything you want, give you anything I can. You brought music back into my life, Eleanor. You brought joy and hope and love. A music room is the least I can do." That winter was harsh, with snow piling high and temperatures dropping far below freezing, but Eleanor had never been happier. She and James settled into married life with ease, as if they had been together for years rather than months. She continued teaching at the school in town when the weather permitted, and she kept up her piano students on weekends. James surprised her by asking her to teach him to play, and though his fingers were clumsy on the keys at first, he practiced diligently. "I want to be able to play with you," he explained when she asked why he was working so hard at it. "I want to share this thing that you love." By spring, true to his word, James began construction on a music room addition to the house. He hired carpenters from town, but he did much of the work himself, determined to make it perfect. Eleanor watched the room take shape with wonder. It was large and bright, with windows on 3 sides and a high ceiling for better acoustics. James installed the best wood stove money could buy to keep it warm, and he had the walls specially finished to enhance the sound. When it was complete in late May, they held a grand party to celebrate. Eleanor gave a concert, playing for an audience of neighbors and friends, and at the end, James joined her for a simple duet they had been practicing. His playing was still halting, but the love in his eyes as they played together made Eleanor's heart swell. That summer, Eleanor discovered she was expecting a child. The news filled both of them with joy tinged with natural anxiety. The nearest doctor was in town, and James immediately began making plans to ensure Eleanor would have the best care possible. She continued her activities as long as she felt able, teaching and playing and managing the household, but James fussed over her constantly, making her rest and insisting she not overwork herself. Their son was born in February of 1884, during a howling blizzard that trapped them at the ranch for 3 days. The midwife had made it just in time, and Eleanor labored through the night while wind screamed around the house. When she finally held her baby boy in her arms, looking down at his tiny, perfect face, she felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. "What should we name him?" James asked, sitting beside her on the bed with tears running unashamedly down his face. "Thomas," Eleanor said, "after your father." Thomas Mitchell. The years that followed were full and rich. Young Thomas grew into a sturdy, cheerful boy who loved music as much as his mother did. He was picking out tunes on the piano by the time he was 3, much to Eleanor's delight. The ranch prospered under James's management, growing from a modest operation to one of the most successful in the region. Eleanor's music school expanded as well, and she eventually hired an assistant teacher to help with the growing number of students. In the spring of 1886, Eleanor gave birth to twin daughters, Mary and Catherine, named after both their grandmothers. The house rang with children's laughter and music, exactly as James had once said he hoped it would. He proved to be a devoted father, somehow finding time despite the demands of the ranch to play with his children and be present for the important moments. On their 5th wedding anniversary, James took Eleanor back to the music room, the one he had built for her. Over the years, it had become the heart of their home, the place where she taught and practiced, and where the family gathered in the evenings. "Do you remember what you said the day we met?" James asked, pulling her close. "You said the piano was not merely a possession, that it was a connection to your mother and to everything you had lost." "I remember," Eleanor said softly. "And you offered me a home without even knowing me, just because you understood that some things are too important to give up." "I told you I would build a room around your piano," James said. "But the truth is, you built a home around my heart. You took a broken man living in an empty house and gave me a reason to hope again. You gave me love and children and music and joy. Every day with you is a gift." Eleanor kissed him then, pouring 5 years of love and gratitude into the embrace. "We built this together," she said. "This life, this family, this home. You gave me a place for my piano, but you also gave me a place to belong." As if on cue, they heard the sounds of Thomas at the piano in the music room, picking out a melody while his little sisters sang along in their childish voices. James and Eleanor stood together, arms around each other, listening to the music that filled their home. It was imperfect and joyful and absolutely beautiful, just like the life they had created together on their Montana ranch. The summer Thomas turned 8, Eleanor started teaching him more seriously, moving beyond simple melodies to proper technique and theory. He proved to have real talent, with his mother's ear for music and his father's determination to master anything he set his mind to. The twins, now 5 years old, were also showing musical aptitude, though they were more interested in singing than in playing instruments. One evening in August, a traveling theatrical troupe passed through Silver Creek and gave a performance at the town hall. James insisted the whole family attend, and they all dressed in their finest clothes for the occasion. The performance included opera excerpts, dramatic readings, and musical interludes. Eleanor sat entranced, transported back to her childhood when her mother had taken her to similar performances in Boston. On the ride home that night, with the children drowsing in the back of the wagon, James took Eleanor's hand. "You were meant for more than this small town," he said quietly. "I saw your face during that performance. You belong on a stage like that." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I am exactly where I am meant to be. I do not need a stage or an audience beyond our family and students. This life we have built is more than I ever dreamed possible." "Still," James persisted, "I want you to have every opportunity. What if we organized a proper concert series here? Brought in performers from Denver or even back east. You could perform as well, share your gift with more people." The idea took root, and by the following spring, Eleanor and James had organized the first annual Silver Creek Music Festival. They held it at the ranch, setting up a stage in the barn which James had cleaned and decorated for the occasion. Eleanor performed, along with several students and 2 professional musicians they had hired from Denver. The event was such a success that it became a yearly tradition, growing larger and more ambitious with each passing summer. As the children grew, the ranch house seemed to shrink, so James added more rooms, always consulting with Eleanor about what she wanted. They expanded the kitchen, added a proper library, built a larger dining room to accommodate the frequent gatherings they hosted. The music room remained Eleanor's sanctuary, though it was rarely quiet with 3 musical children competing for practice time. In 1891, when Thomas was 14 and the twins were 10, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. The pregnancy was harder than her previous ones, perhaps because she was now 32 and feeling the years of hard work and frontier living. James hovered anxiously, and even the children seemed to sense that this time was different. Eleanor spent more time resting, though she chafed at the inactivity. Their second son, William, was born in January of 1892 after a difficult labor that frightened James badly. But Eleanor recovered well, and little William proved to be a content, easy baby who seemed to arrive already understanding his place in their boisterous household. Thomas doted on his baby brother, and the twins appointed themselves his protectors. That spring, a representative from a music conservatory in San Francisco visited the ranch, having heard about Eleanor's teaching and the music festival. He offered Thomas a full scholarship to attend the conservatory, praising his exceptional talent. The offer threw the household into turmoil. Thomas was only 15, still a boy in many ways, and the thought of sending him so far away was painful for everyone. They discussed it for weeks, weighing the opportunity against the cost. Finally, it was Thomas himself who made the decision. "I want to go," he said at a family meeting. "I love music and I want to learn everything I can, but I also want to come back here. This is my home and I want to teach here someday like Mother does." Eleanor felt pride and heartbreak in equal measure. They agreed that Thomas would attend the conservatory, and that September, they made the journey to San Francisco to see him settled. Eleanor cried the entire trip home, but James held her hand and reminded her that they had raised their son to follow his dreams, just as they had followed theirs. Life continued at the ranch, adapting to Thomas's absence. The twins grew into beautiful young women with their mother's musical talent and their father's business sense. Mary wanted to be a singer, while Catherine showed an aptitude for composing music. William was still too young to show clear preferences, but he seemed to love being around horses more than being at the piano. Thomas came home every summer, more polished and educated each year, but still fundamentally the boy who had left. He brought new music with him, new techniques and ideas that excited Eleanor. They would spend hours at the piano together, playing duets and discussing theory, and James would sit nearby, content to watch his wife and son share their passion. In 1896, when Thomas was 19 and finishing his studies, he wrote to say he was bringing someone home to meet the family. Her name was Rebecca, she was a violinist, and he was in love with her. Eleanor and James exchanged knowing looks when they read the letter. They had suspected this might happen eventually. Rebecca turned out to be a lovely young woman from a Philadelphia family, intelligent and talented with a gentle sense of humor that made her fit immediately into their family. She and Thomas were clearly devoted to each other, and Eleanor saw in them an echo of her own young love with James. The wedding was held at the ranch that autumn, with music that made Eleanor cry happy tears through the entire ceremony. Thomas and Rebecca decided to settle in Silver Creek, building a house near the ranch so Thomas could take over much of Eleanor's teaching work. She was 57 now, and while she still loved teaching, she was grateful to share the burden. Rebecca started a string program at the school, and together they expanded the music education available in the area far beyond what Eleanor had ever imagined when she first arrived with nothing but her mother's piano and a determination not to give up what mattered most. The twins married within a year of each other, both to local ranchers' sons they had known since childhood. Mary's husband bought land adjoining James's ranch, while Catherine and her husband decided to try their fortune in Denver, where she hoped to find opportunities for her compositions. William, now 9, declared that he was going to be a rancher like his father and had no interest in music beyond listening to his mother play. "That is perfectly fine," Eleanor assured him. "Not everyone has to be a musician. Your father is not, and he is the finest man I know." "I can play a little," James protested, and Eleanor laughed, kissing his cheek. "You can, my love, and I treasure every note, but you are a cattleman through and through, and there is no shame in that." The turn of the century found the Mitchell family prosperous and settled. James was 64 now, his dark hair gone silver, but still strong and active in running the ranch. Eleanor was 58, with threads of gray in her hair and lines around her eyes from years of smiling. Their children were grown and starting families of their own, and the ranch that had once been just James and his mother was now the center of a sprawling family network. Eleanor still played the piano every day, though arthritis was beginning to stiffen her fingers. She had published several books of piano instruction that were used throughout the Western territories, and her students had gone on to teach music in towns and cities across the region. The music festival had become one of the most important cultural events in Montana, drawing performers and audiences from hundreds of miles away. One evening in the spring of 1902, Eleanor sat at her piano in the music room James had built for her so many years ago. Her hands moved over the keys, playing the chop-in piece she had played that very first day when they had installed the piano in the front room. James came in and settled into his usual chair, the one he had occupied for thousands of evenings over the past 20 years. "Do you remember the day we met?" Eleanor asked, finishing the piece and turning to smile at him. "Every detail," James said. "You stepped off that stagecoach looking terrified and determined in equal measure. And when you mentioned the piano and that poor woman told you there was no room for it, I saw your heart break right there on the street. And you offered me a home," Eleanor said softly. "You did not know anything about me, but you offered me a place for my piano and for myself." "Best decision I ever made," James said, rising to come stand beside her. "You have given me everything good in my life, Eleanor, our children, our grandchildren, this home full of music and love. I would build you 1,000 rooms if you asked." "One was enough," Eleanor said, taking his hand. "One room built around a piano became a home built around love. That is more than enough." They stood together in the music room as the sun set outside the windows, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The piano gleamed in the fading light, still as beautiful as the day Eleanor's mother had first bought it in Boston so many years ago. It had carried Eleanor through loss and grief, across a continent to a new life, and into the arms of a man who understood that some things matter too much to abandon. The years continued to pass gently. Eleanor and James watched their grandchildren grow, teaching piano to those who showed interest and simply loving the ones who did not. Thomas and Rebecca had 3 children who all showed musical talent, keeping the music school thriving. Mary had 4 children who spent their summers at the ranch, learning to ride and fish and appreciate the wide Montana sky. Catherine's compositions began to receive recognition, and she and her husband eventually returned from Denver to settle near the family, their success allowing them to choose where they lived. William proved to be exactly what he had promised, a natural cattleman who loved the ranch with the same passion his mother loved music. When he was 21, James began gradually turning over the management of the ranch to him, secure in the knowledge that it would thrive in his son's capable hands. William married a schoolteacher from town, and they made their home in a house James helped them build on ranch property. In 1910, Eleanor and James celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary quietly, just the 2 of them. They were older now, moving a bit slower but still deeply in love. Eleanor played for James that evening the same Stephen Foster song he had requested so long ago, and her voice was still clear despite the years. "We have had a good life," James said when she finished. "Better than I ever thought possible when I was a young man building this ranch with my mother." "We have," Eleanor agreed. "And it all started because you understood that a piano is not just a piece of furniture. You saw that it represented everything I had to hold on to, and you made space for it." "I made space for you," James corrected. "The piano was just the excuse I needed to ask you to stay." They laughed together, the easy laughter of people who knew each other completely. That night, lying in bed with James's arms around her, Eleanor thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in a dusty Montana town 28 years ago. She had lost everything and been prepared to lose more, to give up the one piece of her mother she had left just to survive in her new life. But instead, she had found a man who built a room around her piano, who built a life around her heart. She had found love and home and family in the wide Montana sky. Her music had spread far beyond that single piano in her mother's Boston parlor, touching hundreds of lives through teaching and performance, and the simple joy of sharing something beautiful. Years later, when Eleanor was 72 and James was 78, they still lived at the ranch, though most of the work was done by William and his family now. Eleanor's hands were too stiff with arthritis to play the piano as she once had, but she still sat at it every day, picking out simple melodies and teaching her great-grandchildren the basics. The piano itself had weathered the years beautifully, lovingly maintained by generations of Mitchells who understood its importance. It sat in the music room James had built, the room that had been expanded and renovated over the years but never lost its essential purpose as the heart of their home. One autumn evening, with the aspens turning gold outside the windows, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a reunion. There were dozens of them now, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, filling every room with noise and laughter. After dinner, they all gathered in the music room for an impromptu concert. Thomas played a sonata, Rebecca accompanied him on violin, Mary sang with her daughters, Catherine performed one of her own compositions, and several of the grandchildren stumbled through pieces they had been learning. When it was over, young James Thomas Mitchell, Thomas and Rebecca's oldest grandson and Eleanor's namesake in spirit if not in name, approached her shyly. He was 8 years old, the same age Thomas had been when Eleanor started teaching him seriously. "Great-grandma," he said, "will you tell us the story about how you and great-grandpa met, about the piano?" Eleanor looked at James, who smiled and nodded. She gathered the children around her, all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who could understand, and began to tell the story. She told them about Boston and loss, about a long journey west with nothing but hope and her mother's piano. She told them about stepping off a stagecoach and thinking she would have to give up the last piece of her past to survive in her new life. "And then your great-grandfather, who did not know me at all, offered me a home," she said, smiling at James across the room. "He said there was room at his ranch for my piano, and when I worried it might be an imposition, do you know what he told me?" "What?" several children asked in unison. Eleanor's eyes met James's, and they shared a look that held nearly 30 years of love. "He said, 'I will build a room around it,' and he did. He built a beautiful music room where I could teach and play, but more than that, he built a home around my heart. He understood that sometimes the things we love are the things we need most, and we should never have to give them up." "Is that why there are always pianos in our houses?" young James asked. "Because great-grandpa built a room for yours," partly, Eleanor said. "But also because music is a gift meant to be shared. That is what my mother taught me and what I have tried to teach all of you. The piano brought me here, but love built everything else." The children dispersed eventually, running off to play, but Eleanor remained in her chair by the piano. James came to sit beside her, taking her hand in his weathered one. "It is a good story," he said. "True, too. The best stories are," Eleanor replied. "We have been blessed, James, so very blessed." "We have," he agreed. "And it all started with a piano, and a woman brave enough to bring it halfway across the country, because she knew some things matter too much to leave behind." They sat together in the room he had built for her, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. Photographs on the walls, music scattered across stands and tables, the worn bench of the piano that had carried them both through decades of joy and sorrow. Outside, the Montana sun was setting over mountains that had watched their love grow from a chance meeting to a legacy that would extend for generations. Eleanor leaned her head on James's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. In that moment, she thought about all the rooms that had mattered in her life. The parlor in Boston where her mother had first taught her to play, the tiny apartment where she and her father had struggled after the money ran out, the cramped quarters above the general store that had awaited her in Silver Creek. But this room, the music room James had built because he understood what mattered to her heart, this was the room that had made all the difference. He had not just built a room around her piano. He had built a life around her dreams, a home around her music, a family around their love. The piano had been the beginning, but everything that followed had been the true gift: partnership, understanding, respect, and a love that had weathered every storm and grown stronger with each passing year. As darkness fell outside and lamplight filled the music room with a golden glow, Eleanor thought that if she could go back and speak to that frightened young woman stepping off the stagecoach with her mother's piano, she would tell her not to be afraid. She would say that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations, and sometimes the people we need most appear exactly when we need them, offering impossible kindness that changes everything. James Mitchell had offered her a home for her piano, but he had given her so much more. He had given her roots and wings, security and freedom, a place to belong and space to grow. Their children had inherited not just the ranch or musical talent, but the understanding that love means making room for what matters to the people we cherish, building around their needs and dreams rather than asking them to diminish themselves to fit into spaces too small. The piano still stood in the music room, as solid and beautiful as ever, a testament to one woman's determination not to lose the last connection to her mother, and one man's recognition that some things are worth protecting. Around it, a family had grown and flourished, generation after generation carrying forward the music and the love that had started with a simple offer made on a dusty street in a Montana town. Eleanor closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of her family throughout the house, and felt James's steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. This was what home sounded like: laughter and music, children playing and adults talking, the creak of floorboards in a house well lived in, the whisper of wind through windows open to the Montana night. This was what love looked like. A room built for a piano, a life built for joy, a family built on the foundation of two people who chose each other and kept choosing each other every single day for nearly 3 decades. She had asked if the ranch had room for her old piano. James had said he would build a room around it. And in doing so, he had given her everything. A home, a family, a purpose, and a love that would echo through generations, as enduring as the mountains that surrounded their Montana valley, as beautiful as the music that had brought them together and kept them strong through all the years of their remarkable life.